Hello and welcome to Capitol Hill. I'm Lyndall Curtis. The Defence Minister and the Defence Force have deplored an attack by what's believed to be a child suicide bomber in Afghanistan that's left an Australian AusAid worker, David Savage, and others injured. The Minister says the use of children in such a way is contemptible. Stephen Smith, the Defence Minister, has also been dealing with a report out of the United States that raises the prospect of using the Cocos Islands as an airfield, as a base for US drones. Joining me to discuss the day are Greens Senator Lee Rhiannon and Liberal MP Josh Frydenberg. Welcome to you both.
Hello.
Good afternoon, Lee. Hi. Hi, Lyndall.
If we can go first to the attack in Afghanistan that wounded David Savage, the AusAid worker, as well as 3 ISAF Security Assistance Force soldiers and an innocent Afghan child. Josh Frydenberg, this shows that Afghanistan is still a dangerous place, doesn't it?
Absolutely. It's a very fragile security situation, and there are daily reminders of that. Look, let's hope that David Savage makes a speedy and full recovery. He's clearly somebody who has worked in the field in East Timor, in Mozambique, in Bougainville, and given a lot for his country and for helping those less fortunate than him. So this is a very sad and deplorable attack, but we hope that David makes a full recovery.
Lee, the Defence Force says a child suicide bomber is believed to be responsible for the attack. That raises its own set of questions and difficulties for Australian troops if they're having to be on the lookout for children now, doesn't it?
Oh, it certainly does. It's very confronting. I certainly join Josh in wishing David and his family it must be a hard time, and the whole AusAid team. It'd be very troubling to hear this latest news. It's confronting how the situation is unfolding in Afghanistan, and the news is still there that most of the 49 countries that make up the NATO coalition now have exit plans. Australia is one of the few countries that hasn't been clear about it. And when it comes to the aid and the military arrangements in that country, the lines have been blurred considerably, and we certainly believe, I understand that the Minister has announced there will be an investigation. He does need to make that very public, because we would consider if there needs to be a full inquiry into how this has played out and the implications for our very important aid program in Afghanistan.
In what way are you talking about the lines being blurred?
Well, in Afghanistan, the aid programs delivered by AusAid, part of our public overseas development programs, are very closely linked with military operations. The Australian Defence Forces are involved in the delivery of most of those programs, and we do now need to be clear on who benefits that aid and how it's delivered. The Greens have received numerous reports about hospitals and schools often being built in the wrong place, not being buildings that are actually useful for the communities, often becoming targets for the Taliban and the other insurgents. So there is a blurring of responsibilities here, and very sadly this latest attack has put the spotlight on that problem.
Josh, do you see any problems with responsibilities being blurred, or the interaction between Australian aid workers and the Australian military?
Look, I think Lee's factually incorrect there. Australia's made it very clear we have an exit strategy. Julia Gillard has articulated that numerous times to the Parliament, and she has the support of Tony Abbott, and that's at the end of 2014. As for Afghanistan itself and the aid projects there, I think we are making a real difference on the ground. I went to Afghanistan last year and I saw the school that was being built for girls, because females do not have the same educational opportunities as males do in the Afghan population. So I think we are making an important contribution. I don't know where Lee's getting her information about there, and I find that we should be focusing on David Savage here and this very unfortunate attack, and hoping he's to get better, and not really talking about blurred lines of distinction which really are made up by the Greens.
Lee, while the Greens have problems with Australian troops in Afghanistan, do you accept that Australia should be there in the much longer term with civilian assistance for building Afghanistan, building the structures Afghanistan will need in the future?
Oh yes, absolutely. And Josh has really been quite inaccurate there. There have been a number of concerns raised by various aid organisations about how these programs are playing out. It is a complex situation, and I'd be surprised if the coalition didn't want to investigate this so we can ensure that our aid dollars are achieving what the stated objectives are here. So there is a great deal of work that needs to be done. The current situation is complex, the lines are blurred, and that really cannot be denied.
We'll move on now to the consideration of any use of Cocos Islands by the US military. Josh, the Defence Minister says that is a very long-term prospect. It's well down the queue of things that are being considered in the military cooperation between Australia and the United States. Would you have any qualms, though, should that happen?
Look, I think the first point is the most important, that there is no specific proposal on the table here, Lyndall. We don't know about timeframes and we don't know about costs. Secondly, were Australia to go down this path and to deepen and widen the security relationship we have with the United States, in my view, that's a positive thing. The United States is our long-term ally. We have the ANZUS alliance since 1951. We have a deep security relationship going back to the beginning of the 20th century. It's a very important relationship, and I believe we can deepen our security ties with the United States without compromising any of our other relationships in the region, including with the Chinese. Let me say about the Greens, they're going to take a very different point of view, because if you go to the Greens policy document on the internet and you go and look at paragraph 33 when it comes to their peace and security policy, they want to, in their words, abolish the ANZUS alliance unless it can be revised. And I believe that the ANZUS alliance underwrites Australia's security. It's critical to the region. We're seeing a number of our partners in the region, whether it's Singapore, whether it's the Philippines, whether it's Japan, whether it's Korea, all deepen and strengthen their ties with the United States, and that's consistent with what Australia is and will be doing into the future.
Lee, the Minister says the prospect of using Cocos Islands is years and years away, and he said the prospect of using drones there, while he didn't rule it out, but he seemed to suggest it's remote, saying the drones haven't been developed that can do the sort of maritime work that would be needed there. Do you accept consideration of this is some way off and has a question mark over it?
But it hasn't been ruled out. That's the critical piece of information that has come out today since that information was reported in the Washington Post. And I think it's worth us remembering when Josh and I were with you last, Lyndall, back in November, and Josh tried to dismiss the concerns we raised at the time about US military presence in Australia by saying it's only 2,500 troops. What we're seeing is an incremental advance in the level of US deployment in this country. It's not only troops, it's also a air base, air operations, it's naval operations involving submarines and warships, and now there's the talk of on Cocos Islands of stationing drones. Now these are these unmanned warcraft. They're often presented just as spy planes, but as we know from operations in South Asia, can go much further. Many civilians have died. If this went ahead, it would further destabilise the region at a time when we really should be using cooperation and communication with our neighbours and not sending out military signals that we're allowing and assisting the US to build up their military operations in this area.
But Lee, but can I just say, Lyndall, the truth is our partners in the region, our Asian partners, whether it's Indonesia, the Philippines, whether it's Singapore, whether it's Korea or Japan, they're all deepening and broadening their ties with the United States. This is really important, and what Australia is doing with its US Marine deployments through Darwin is an important step forward. Now, we don't have a specific proposal here, but in principle, the coalition believes in strong military ties with the United States, and the Greens are completely off at the other end of the spectrum on this. They don't believe in the ANZUS alliance, and that's very dangerous for Australia because the US helps underwrite our national security.
Lee, do you accept that there is the possibility for the US forces stationed in Australia to be used to do humanitarian work should that need arise?
I do need to first correct Josh's statement. he knows what our policy is. He's often said how he's read it. We're not ruling out and calling for the abolition of the ANZUS Treaty. It needs to be renegotiated so it works for this region.
What are the exact words? What are the exact words,
constructive words. You know what that is. It's calling for a review, Josh. And that's what is the critical part. That is what's the critical part of this discussion. And what we need to remember, and you made reference to the US ties in the region. Now, the US ties in the region are not just in terms of economic ties, but Philippines, Thailand, Indonesia, Singapore, Malaysia, they're all involved with the US in a military build-up at the moment. If there is a greater penetration of this region, Australia should be giving a responsible leadership. Considering our economic relationship with China, it is sending a very bad signal in this region that is really going back to the last century.
Lee, if I could interrupt, would you agree then with the government's decision to ban the Chinese telco Huawei from tendering for work on the NBN?
Well, I certainly think we need to be cautious here. We don't have all the information, and I think that's where the government is making a mistake. If AECL has given an adverse assessment here, surely at least some of that information should be made publicly available. When you consider that the NBN is the largest infrastructure project we've had for generations, will be critical to our economic growth, civilian life on so many levels, clearly the Greens believe we need to be cautious, but the government does need to be much more open with what has happened here.
Do you have any concerns about the government decision, Josh?
Look, I'm not going to second guess the government on this one, Lyndall, and that's because I understand their decision is based on an adverse assessment by ASIO. They're the ones with all the information, and unfortunately for Lee, they're not going to be able to release that information publicly, and for good reason. The second, I think, important point is that cyber warfare and cyber attacks are on the rise globally, and so Australia has to be extra careful when we are building the NBN to ensure that we protect our privacy and that we protect our systems going forward, and that it means basing our decisions on contractors and the like on what our security intelligence forces are suggesting.
I'll ask you a quick question to both of you because we're about to run out of time. Do you think the decision has any raises the prospect of damaging Australia's relations with China? Josh, first to you.
No, I don't. I think this was a decision taken by the Australian government on the advice of its agencies, and I do not think it will worsen the relationship in any way with China.
And Lee?
On that one, I would agree with Josh. There's obviously a robust economic relationship between China and Australia. Australia's made the right move here.
And that's where we'll have to leave it. Lee Rhiannon and Josh Frydenberg, thank you very much for your time today.
Thank you. Thanks, Lee.
And thank you for joining Capitol Hill today. Please join us at the same time tomorrow. Good night.